The doll from the attic. Dust floated in the air like dying embers, swirling in the dim light that seeped through the attic's cracked wooden slats. The place smelled of age, moldy paper, dry wood, something almost sweet, like forgotten childhood memories rotting in the heat. Mark wiped the sweat from his forehead, grumbling as he shoved an old cardboard box aside. He didn't even know why he was up here. The house had belonged to his grandparents, then to his father, and now it was his. A generational relic filled with junk nobody had touched in years. And, unfortunately, it was his responsibility to clean it up. He pulled another box toward him, prying open its brittle lid. Inside, a tangle of old clothes, yellowed photographs, a porcelain tea set, and his fingers froze. A doll. A damn doll, sitting there with its cracked, dirty face staring up at him. Its glass eyes, once painted a bright blue, were now faded to a ghostly gray. The lips were chipped, the edges curled up in a permanent, unsettling smirk. The dress, pale blue with frayed lace, looked as though it had been pristine once, but time had eaten away at it. Mark hated dolls. Always had. Something about their lifeless faces pretending to be human, their stiff limbs waiting to move when you weren't looking. He swallowed, shook his head, and grabbed the thing by its thin, delicate arm. Its skin was cold, too cold, like something that had never been alive but refused to die. He marched down the attic steps, out the front door, and straight to the garbage bin by the curb. Without ceremony, he tossed the doll in, slammed the lid shut, and dusted his hands. "Not my problem anymore," he muttered. That night, he slept like a man who had won a small but satisfying battle. No more digging through useless junk, no more creepy old dolls. Just the quiet hum of the ceiling fan and the rhythmic ticking of the clock by his bed. The world was normal. Safe. Until he woke up. His body shivered before his mind fully registered why. The air felt wrong, too still, too heavy. The kind of quiet that belonged to places where something waited. Slowly, he turned his head toward the foot of the bed. And there she was. Sitting upright, her cracked lips curled in their eternal smirk. Mark shot up so fast the sheets tangled around his legs, nearly sending him to the floor. His breath hitched, his skin prickling with cold sweat. He hadn't brought the doll inside. He had thrown it away. Outside. His heart pounded as he reached for it, fingers hesitant, almost afraid that the thing would move on its own. It didn't. It was just a doll. Just a stupid, old doll. With stiff movements, he grabbed it and stormed outside. The garbage bin was still closed. The lid heavy when he flipped it open. The doll wasn't inside. Nope. Not dealing with this. He marched to the back of the house, to the fire pit where he burned yard waste and old papers. He dropped the doll into the pit, grabbed the lighter fluid, and doused it without hesitation. His fingers shook as he struck the match. The flames rose quickly, licking at the porcelain face, turning the dress to curling embers. A sickly sweet smell filled the air, burning fabric, melting plastic, something else. Something wrong. Mark stood there for a long time, watching until the fire had eaten everything. There was no going back now. It was gone. And yet, that night, long after the flames had died, something whispered in the darkness. Not words. Not exactly. Just the sound of something that shouldn't be there, something just beyond the edge of understanding. A scrape. A shuffle. A breath. He told himself it was just the wind. The next morning, when the doorbell rang, Mark hesitated before answering. The world outside was bright, normal, untouched by the creeping unease that had settled in his chest. He took a breath, forced himself to shake off the lingering tension, and opened the door. His stomach twisted. On the porch, sitting neatly as if it had never been burned, was the doll. Its cracked porcelain lips curled in silent amusement. And in its tiny, stiff fingers, a single slip of paper. "Don't leave me. I will come back." Mark had to keep his balance to keep from taking a step back, even though his whole body was screaming, "Run." His brain refused to accept the reality of what his eyes saw. The doll should be ashes. He himself stood by the fire, breathing in that terrible smell of melted plastic, seeing black smoke rising into the sky. But now she was before him again, whole, as if nothing had happened. The wind barely stirred the strands of her faded whitish curls, and those glass eyes, faded like a blurred watercolor, looked straight at him. He slowly bent down, took a piece of paper, trying not to touch the doll. His fingers trembled a little as he unfolded the note. The words were written in a childish, uneven handwriting, but the ink looked as if it had not yet had time to dry completely. "Don't leave me. I will be back." Mark was thrown into a fever. He threw the piece of paper down sharply, stomped on it as if it might catch fire and destroy this terrible situation with it. He looked left and right, trying to see someone who might put the doll by the door, some explanation, anything. But the street was quiet, only the wind rustling the dry leaves in the yard. No sign, no joke, no prank. His heart was pounding, but he forced himself to act quickly. He grabbed the doll by its thin plastic hands, feeling how hard and cold they were. It weighed more than he had expected, as if there was something else inside, something other than just emptiness. Gritting his teeth, he walked to the car, slammed the door, and threw the doll into the passenger seat. He could almost feel the gesture clench his stomach. Something about her sitting there gave him a sickening feeling, as if he had just let something dangerous get too close. He started the engine, the tires screeching on the gravel. He didn't care what the neighbors thought of his grim face or how fast he had driven away. All he cared about was getting the damn thing as far away as possible. He drove in silence, without turning on the music, without distractions. But even with the noise of the road and the roar of the engine, he thought he could hear a faint ticking sound. At first, he thought it was something inside the car. But when he glanced at the doll again with his side vision, he realized the sound was coming from it. Could it just be an old mechanism inside? Some kind of clockwork toy? No, it couldn't be. He had seen it up close, no mechanisms. Just cold plastic and the cracks in his face that, damn it, seemed deeper than yesterday. Marco gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his fingers turned white. Sweat covered his skin. He found a remote spot, an old wasteland outside the city where no one went. Without thinking twice, he snatched the doll from the seat, got out of the car, and threw it into the weeds. Somewhere nearby, among the rusty metal and broken things, it fit perfectly into the general landscape of junk. He felt a little better. But when he returned to the car, when he put his hands on the wheel and exhaled deeply, his blood froze. In the rearview mirror, among the motionless stalks of weeds, she sat. She hadn't fallen, hadn't rolled, hadn't fallen to the side. She sat. She watched. She waited. Marco jerked away, as if all the demons in the world were chasing him. The road stretched out ahead, empty and dark, the headlights carving out a narrow path through the endless black. Mark's breath came in short, ragged bursts, his hand slick against the steering wheel. He kept glancing in the rearview mirror, expecting, no, dreading, to see her there. The doll. The goddamn thing that refused to stay gone. But the back seat was empty. The only thing staring back at him was his own pale, sweat-drenched face. He exhaled sharply, forcing himself to focus on the road. Maybe he was losing it. Maybe the stress was finally getting to him. He hadn't been sleeping well, hadn't been eating right. His mind was just playing tricks on him, turning a stupid childhood relic into some kind of horror movie monster. That's all this was. But then... click. A sound so soft he almost missed it. Like a tiny clock, hidden somewhere in the car. Tick, tick, tick. Mark's stomach clenched. His grip on the wheel tightened until his knuckles turned white. He didn't want to look. Didn't want to move. But the sound was getting louder. Closer. Slowly, heart pounding against his ribs, he turned his head. She was there. Not in the back seat. Not in the passenger seat where he had thrown her. The doll sat directly on the dashboard, her cracked porcelain face illuminated by the dim glow of the instrument panel. Her lifeless glass eyes fixed on him, empty, unreadable. Mark screamed. It wasn't a yell, wasn't a curse, it was a full-blown, from the gut, animalistic shriek of terror. His foot slammed down on the brakes, tires screeching as the car skidded to a stop on the side of the road. His pulse thundered in his ears as he scrambled to undo his seatbelt, his only thought, get out. Get out. Get the hell out. But the second he reached for the door handle, the doll moved. Not much. Just a twitch. A tiny shift of her head, like someone barely nodding in acknowledgement. Mark's breath hitched in his throat. Then, the radio crackled to life, blasting nothing but static. And beneath it, faint, distorted, buried in the white noise, a child's whisper. Don't leave me again. Mark didn't think. Didn't hesitate. He flung the door open and bolted into the night, leaving the car running, headlights still cutting through the darkness. His feet pounded against the asphalt as he ran, lungs burning, panic driving him forward. He didn't know where he was going, he just needed to be away. But after about 50 yards, something made him stop. A feeling. That sickening, creeping sensation of being watched. The night was quiet. The road empty. No cars, no houses, just endless fields stretching out on either side. His own ragged breathing was the only sound. Then, a whisper of movement behind him. Mark turned. The car was still there, idling, the driver's side door wide open. But the doll was gone. And the whispering hadn't stopped. A gust of cold wind swept across the empty road, rustling the tall grass on either side. Mark stood frozen, his heart hammering against his ribs, his breath coming in sharp, uneven gasps. The whispering hadn't stopped. It wasn't coming from the car anymore. It was coming from the dark. From the fields. From everywhere. A low, rhythmic murmur, like a child humming a lullaby just beneath the surface of hearing. His instinct screamed at him to run, to get the hell away from whatever this was, but his legs refused to move. He swallowed hard, eyes darting to the car. He should just get back in, floor it, drive until the gas ran out, and never look back. But then, the whispering stopped. And the silence that followed was somehow worse. Mark forced himself to take a step forward. Then another. His stomach twisted as he neared the car, the open door yawning like a black hole. The headlights cut into the darkness, revealing nothing but the empty road ahead. The doll was nowhere to be seen. Mark's fingers clenched into fists. I threw her out. Twice. I watched her fall into the garbage. She was gone. Gone. This wasn't possible. None of this was possible. His mind was unraveling, turning shadows into nightmares. That had to be it. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself, then climbed back into the car. The second he sat down, his body went rigid. The air smelled wrong. It wasn't the usual scent of old upholstery and fast food wrappers. It was something faintly sweet, powdery. Like baby powder. Mark's throat went dry. The passenger seat was empty. But the smell was stronger there. He reached out, hesitant, fingers brushing against the worn fabric. Something grabbed his wrist. Cold. Small. Too strong. Mark recoiled with a choked scream, jerking back so fast he slammed his head against the steering wheel. Pain shot through his skull, but he barely felt it. His eyes were locked on the seat. Nothing. The space was empty. The smell was fading. His skin burned where the unseen fingers had gripped him. He fumbled for the keys, his shaking hands barely able to turn the ignition. The car roared to life, and he didn't waste a second. He hit the gas, tires screeching as he tore down the road, gripping the wheel so tight his knuckles turned white. He wasn't going home. Not anymore. He didn't know where he was going, but he needed people. Lights. Noise. Anything but the deafening quiet of this road, of this night, of whatever the hell was happening to him. The town was about 10 miles ahead. A shitty little diner stayed open all night. He just needed to make it there. Sit under fluorescent lights. Drink terrible coffee. Remind himself he was a grown man, not a terrified kid. He forced his breathing to slow. This is over. I left it behind. It's done. But then, a shape appeared in the middle of the road. His heart stopped. Tiny. Motionless. Sitting right in the center of the cracked asphalt, bathed in the glow of his headlights. The doll. She was waiting for him. Mark's breath hitched, his pulse hammering in his ears. The doll sat in the center of the road, bathed in the harsh glow of his headlights, its tiny plastic hands resting in its lap, its glassy eyes fixed straight ahead. His foot hovered over the brake, but some part of him, some deep, primal part, screamed not to stop. Not to acknowledge it. Just keep driving. But his body betrayed him. The car screeched to a halt just a few feet away. The headlights cast long, distorted shadows around the doll, stretching it into something grotesque. Mark's hands clenched the wheel so hard his fingers ached. His throat felt raw, as if he'd been screaming, though he hadn't made a sound. The doll didn't move. Of course, it didn't. It was just a stupid, old, plastic toy. That's all it was. And yet, the night felt heavier now, pressing in around him, as if the darkness itself were watching, waiting. He forced himself to breathe, to think. He wasn't going to touch it again. That was a mistake the first time. He wasn't going to throw it out, either. What if it came back? What if it never left? His foot nudged the gas. He could drive around it. Just as his fingers twitched on the wheel, movement flickered in the rearview mirror. Mark's stomach dropped. The back seat. A shape. Small. Still. He knew what he would see before he even turned his head. The doll was sitting behind him. No transition. No sound. Just there. It sat upright, its plastic limbs arranged neatly, its vacant eyes locked onto his. Mark's body went cold. A wrong kind of cold. The kind that seeped into his bones, into his brain. He couldn't breathe. Couldn't think. Then, without meaning to, without realizing he was even moving, he reached out and yanked the rear door handle. The door flew open. The doll didn't fall. It didn't slide out onto the asphalt like any ordinary object would. It stood up. Mark's scream caught in his throat. Tiny plastic feet shifted. The doll stepped forward, its expression still frozen, still blank, but somehow expectant. His foot slammed onto the gas pedal. The car shot forward, tires spinning against the pavement. The door swung shut from the force, and Mark didn't dare look back. He didn't care where he was going anymore, as long as it was away. He blew past the road signs, past the turnoff to town, past everything familiar. He didn't stop. Not for lights, not for stop signs, not until the dark highway gave way to something else. A gas station. The bright, flickering fluorescence made the world feel real again, even if just for a moment. He pulled into the empty lot, throwing the car into park, gripping the wheel as if it was the only thing anchoring him to reality. His pulse thundered in his ears. His hands wouldn't stop shaking. He turned, forcing himself to look at the back seat. Empty. No doll. No footprints. Just old fast food bags and a jacket he'd meant to take inside weeks ago. A laugh bubbled up in his throat, wild and humorless. He was losing it. Completely. But then, a soft sound. From outside the car. Not the wind. Not the hum of the gas station's buzzing lights. A whisper. right outside his window. Slowly, Mark turned his head. The doll stood just beyond the glass. It held something in its tiny hands. A scrap of yellowed paper, smeared with something dark. Scrawled across it in uneven, childlike letters were 4 simple words. "Don't leave me again."